In the early morning hours of November 9th, 2005, a crowd gathers nervously around an apartment in the lower-income part of the city of Manaus, Brazil. A reporter first on the scene describes the very tense developing situation as, quote, "A criminal, a thug, has taken a family hostage, including a child." The B-roll news footage pans around, showing local police in bulletproof vests with handguns aimed at a barred door where we see a mom and a young boy who can't be any older than 8. Then we see the kidnapper. He's surrounded with nowhere to go. He knows he's in over his head. The crowd fears for the lives of the family. Quote, "He's threatening to kill the whole family if the police try to touch him," the reporter says. Clearly, the kidnapper is scared for his own life. He's willing to negotiate for it. And he wants to do it through a man named Wallace Souza. Souza isn't a trained negotiator. He's not even law enforcement. Wallace Souza is a TV personality. He's the wildly popular host of a Brazilian variety show called Canal Livre, and he's arguably the most popular man in the entire city of 2 million people. Despite how this sounds on the surface, an armed kidnapper wanting to talk to a TV show host to save his own life, this request doesn't surprise anyone. Yes, Souza is the host of one of those zany South American variety shows with the music and the colors and the dancing girls. But first and foremost, Canal Livre is a local crime news show. Yes, a variety crime news show exists where anyone tuning in could see musical performances, games, raffles, and even a puppet paired with graphic and explicit stories and video footage of gang violence, drug seizures, and fresh murder scenes. Footage so bloody and gruesome that even the seasoned editor of the show said he had a hard time stomaching it. That's Canal Livre, and right now, in the wee hours of this November morning, the reporter talking to us is gathering live footage of a potentially devastating hostage situation for an upcoming broadcast. Never one to shy away from a camera. When Wallace Souza gets the phone call and hears that a criminal wants to talk to him in person during a live hostage situation, he gets out of bed and makes his way to the scene. Unlike what we see in movies and TV, Souza doesn't talk to the kidnapper over a megaphone behind a cop car. Instead, he immediately enters the house to talk to the kidnapper. A few tense moments go by and he finally exits the front door with a gun to his back. Allegedly, the kidnapper told him, quote, "If you can guarantee my life, I'll come out." He says he'll drive himself to the police station to surrender if Wallace Souza rides shotgun with him. So that's what Souza does. He heroically sacrifices and exchanges himself to spare the family, marches into a pickup truck by gunpoint, and off they go. The footage is shaky at this point. Literally. The reporter and cameraman are running to try to keep up with the pickup truck until, bang! A gunshot rings out. The truck coasts to a stop and puts its blinking hazards on, because, safety first and all. Another tense moment goes by. Nobody knows if Souza is dead or alive until he exits the pickup unharmed. He shakes the kidnapper's hand, then calmly walks back down the road as the truck speeds away. A reporter immediately tracks him down for an interview. As a police chase ensues behind him, Souza coolly tells the reporter, quote, "They wanted to go to jail, but on the way they changed their mind. The hunt for the criminals will continue." That last quip is quintessential to Wallace Souza. And this whole incident sums him up perfectly because this wasn't the first instance of Souza inserting himself into a criminal situation for his own show. He's done it many times before and would do it many times after. His own hunt for criminals would never end, at least not until the day he died, because Wallace Souza was basically the real-life Batman of Manaus, a larger-than-life personality who was the only man with the means and resources to do what the police couldn't: clean up the violent streets of a city riddled with crime. But unlike Batman, Souza didn't live in the shadows, or hide behind a mask, or even hide his true identity. It was the exact opposite. Everything he did, from drug raids to shootouts to hostage negotiations, was captured on camera and aired for the entire city to watch. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. Because what Souza was really doing behind the scenes would leave Brazil and the rest of the world shocked for years to come. This is the crazy story of the Brazilian Batman, or more like Two-Face, Wallace Souza, and his even crazier show, Canal Livre, that aired from 1996 to 2009. Through it, he helped capture and convict hundreds of violent criminals, drug dealers, and even solved a few murders in Brazil's 7th largest city, which in return boosted his ratings until he had the #1 show in the region. A win-win, right? Well, not really. Not at all, actually. there was a very dark, very shady secret behind Wallace Souza's success. One that would land the man whose entire existence was dedicated to eradicating crime behind bars. And for good reason. But like any good vigilante character, we were left with the question, did his ends justify his means? To truly answer that and to understand the complicated story of Wallace Souza, you have to understand the city that is Manaus, Brazil. But before you can understand that, you should understand that I want to say, hello everybody. Today we're talking about the TV host who committed murders to keep up their own ratings. Or at least had murders carried out. You'll see. If someone just told you the details of the story we're going to talk about today, you would assume it was fiction. And even then, unbelievable fiction at that. I mean, a TV show host who covers violent crimes, and it turns out was committing violent crimes to then be covered by him. It is such an absurd story that I am amazed it's not talked about more. So if that sounds interesting to you, then stick around after the ad as we talk about the sordid history of Wallace Souza, and if he was a vigilante or a cold-blooded killer. But you know what's another resource that there's only a limited supply of? That's right, your health. Taking care of yourself is even easier thanks to today's sponsor, AG1. AG1 is your one-stop shop for many of your body support needs like multivitamins, multiminerals, pre and probiotics, so you can make taking care of yourself easier than ever. And by easy, I really do mean easy, because all you need is 8 to 12 ounces of water and a spoonful of AG1 and you're good to go. And supporting things like the health of your immune system, your gut, and your brain is certainly something you don't want to skip out on. AG1's been a huge help to me because I'm sure like many of you that watch YouTube a lot, no offense, as someone that makes YouTube videos, my diet is not what it should be. Cold pizza and noodles can only get you so far, but AG1 has helped me do things like be more regular and not be as tired throughout the day. And it's not like AG1's some super cure or miracle drug, it's just putting the things into your body that your body's been missing out on. So you can start closing your nutrient gaps and opening up space in your cabinet starting today, because AG1's here with an exclusive offer. That's because if you head to the link in the description at drinkag1.com/Wendigang, along with your order, you'll get an AG1 flavor sampler that includes things like their citrus, tropical, and berry flavors, and their welcome kit that includes things like a shaker bottle and a metal canister to store your AG1 in. So to get in on this $72 of included value, head to the link in the description at drinkag1.com/Wendigang to get yours today. Thank you to AG1 for sponsoring the channel. Their link will be in the description, and we are now back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. So Manaus is the capital city of Brazil's Amazonas state. Yes, Amazonas is where the mighty Amazon River is. Geographically, it's the largest state in Brazil, and many of its cities, towns, and villages are only accessible by boat. So on one side, you have jungle and rainforest and water stretching for miles in every direction, and then suddenly there's this island of concrete, high-rises, cars, and about 2 million people, all under a blanket of constant, heavy, palpable heat. Because of its location, Manaus is isolated in a way most major cities are not, which makes it a place where stuff can happen without the rest of the world noticing, or frankly, and unfortunately, caring. Which is why the most important thing to know about Manaus is that it sits smack dab in the middle of a drug trafficking route. And this is not by accident or coincidence. When cartels move their product out of Colombia or Peru, which is mostly cocaine, it doesn't always travel on roads. A lot of it moves through the Amazon's waterways. The rivers and tributaries and channels serve as the highways, with numerous back roads and a multitude of blind spots. They link all the hidden jungle drug labs to urban hubs, where the drugs get processed and distributed. Manaus sits at the meeting point of the Amazon River and the Rio Negro, another very large river, which is how it became one of the biggest drug hubs in the country. All of this to say, Manaus is a complex and dangerous drug trafficking city. Too much of its population is comprised of rival groups and gangs competing for territory and control. Some local city officials go as far as calling it a murder capital. Reliable violent crime statistics are hard to find for cities with an underbelly that operates like a combination of Gotham City and the Isle of Tortuga from the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, because so many incidents go unreported. But at least one data sheet states that Manaus had a homicide rate of about 40 per 100,000 people in the late 90s, when Souza's Canal Livre first aired. That means 35 to 40-ish murders per 100,000 people. Houston, Texas is a comparable city in terms of size and population. In the late 90s, it was generally considered among the more violent large US cities, and its homicide rate at the time was about 17. So, to be a little reductive, Manaus was incredibly violent, and help wasn't coming anytime soon for the isolated city. Manaus residents and government officials alike needed a hero, and they got one. A hero who just happened to love the spotlight. Like any good superhero, Wallace Souza had a personal and tragic origin story. Also want to call out, you will hear this guy's name pronounced every way you can imagine. A lot of locals pronounce his name as Wallace, but others just call him Wallace. And Souza is pronounced Souza, Souza. And you know what? I mispronounce foreign names constantly in every channel I have, and you berate me in the comments for it constantly, which is fine. That's acceptable. I'm just earmarking that I know I might be mispronouncing this one, and I take ownership of the mispronunciation. In other words, his name's spelled Wallace. I'm going to call him Wallace, not Wallace. That sounded bitter. I didn't mean for it to be bitter. I apologize. Anyway. Before he became a TV host and personality, Souza was a police officer. He served on the Manaus police force from 1979 to 1987 and saw firsthand just how derelict the city had become. It felt like drug-related crime was waiting around every corner, and the problem was only spreading. Then, drugs got his brother. Wallace and Ulysses were tight, but Ulysses had become an addict, and eventually, it killed him. It was at this moment that Souza developed his intense hatred for violent crime. More specifically, drug-related crime, which really was most of the crime that existed there. Souza became determined to stop it, even if that meant using extreme measures. Quote, "There's only one way to stop drug dealers. Bullets. Bullets in the grave. That's all they deserve." I know this may be hard to understand given the title of this video and where you may think this video is going, but it's going to be really hard for me to not find this guy cool. You'll understand in a minute. It's worth noting that Souza was fired from the force for his alleged involvement in pension fraud and stealing fuel. Allegations he denied, of course, saying he'd been set up because he was investigating a different fraud scheme. Either way, a few years after he was forced out of the police department in disgrace, Souza still felt a powerful urge to avenge his brother. But he didn't do it using guns and bullets, at least not his own. In 1913, Louis Brandeis, one of the more famous and fair U.S. Supreme Court justices in history, wrote the quote, "Sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants." Given that this was in the political magazine Harper's Weekly and not everyone's favorite domestic magazine Good Housekeeping, Brandeis obviously wasn't writing about germs. He was talking about transparency. Visibility and exposure is how you got rid of crime and corruption, and that's exactly what Wallace Souza wanted to do with all the criminals in Manaus. He would expose them, their names and their faces and their locations on television, and he would let the cops use the bullets after that. Souza started Canal Livre in 1996 on a local broadcast station. Originally, it was just your boring old America's Most Wanted, or Dateline NBC, a more standard, traditional format of a police and crime show that didn't have fun pop songs and girls in skimpy outfits. It also only dealt with crimes in and around the Amazonas region, where there was no shortage of content. Souza reported on these somewhat calmly with no flair or panache. It was like televised versions of a local crime blotter. Still, Canal Livre became somewhat popular, somewhat quickly, but that wasn't enough for Souza. He needed the entire city on his side in order to do what he wanted to do. Infamous director Roger Corman, aka the Pope of Pop Cinema, aka the King of Cult, has been on the record as saying something like, "If you have death or sex every 10 pages on a screenplay, people will watch that movie." That's basically the idea behind what Souza turned Canal Livre into. Starting in 1998, Souza may or may not have stolen a few bits and pieces of a more popular show called Programa do Ratcheno. This was one of the top 5 most watched variety shows in São Paulo, Brazil's largest city. With no real standard format, this show had a randomness to it that was addictive to watch. It had disjointed segments strung together that were popular in American talk shows at the time as well, like paternity and DNA test reveals, paranormal readings, lighthearted pranks, and so on. Souza added a similar randomness to his crime show, but took it a step further. He also took elements from other top variety shows in Brazil like Domingo do Fasto, which was probably the highest rated variety show in Brazil, and Programa Silvio Santos, which attracted tons of viewers from multiple generations. What these shows had in common were lively musical performers, audience interaction, and fun chaos. But the biggest thing they shared was the ratings. eyes on screens, millions and millions of viewers. So in addition to the crime center of the show, Souza added elements from the complete other side of the spectrum. In its final form, Canal Livre packed in everything sensationalist that one screen could handle. True crime, sex appeal, music, fun, murder, gore, and drama. It was a real buffet of insanity. Local pop singers would perform smutty novelty songs right before the audience watched clips of a drug dealer being frog marched to a police car. Girls wearing sequins or boas or go-go boots shook the things you could imagine they were shaking right before the audience watched footage of paramedics pushing a bloody corpse on a gurney. Comedians did bits and martial artists did demonstrations right after Souza interviewed a family member who literally just saw their loved one get murdered. Every now and then, between videos of homes with bullets through windows and cops finding hidden cocaine and drug dens, the camera featured a puppet named Gallarito. That's right, a puppet for the True Crime Murder Show. The True Crime Murder Show with exotic dancers, if you will. Gallarito hung out near the side of the stage, always ready to toss in a wisecrack when things got too serious. Normally, wisecracks about someone being gay. The jabs were usually directed at a man named Gil, who sold his homemade Sophias, a Middle Eastern pie-type dish, to the members of the audience. Once this puppet relentlessly mocked Gil so much that the food vendor physically attacked it. Again, it being a puppet, and eventually had to be restrained by other members of the studio audience. The show was exactly what Souza wanted, random chaos, and the residents of Manaus ate it up. Despite how all of this sounds, it never felt like Souza was doing this for the ratings. It genuinely felt like he had a pulse on the community and was doing this in the best interest of a city that he cared about deeply. He didn't feel larger than life, he felt like a neighbor. One time, Souza invited a man onto the show whose car could no longer drive safely because 2 of his tires had been worn way past the threads. In a sweet moment that left the man in tears, Souza surprised him with 2 usable tires. This particular instance also epitomized how underdeveloped of a city Manaus was. Despite being a highly rated show, Canal Livre didn't have the kind of money that Americanized reality shows like Oprah might have. The kind where they give away things that a person doesn't really need so they can promote whatever new car or airline they were sponsored by. Canal Livre couldn't give this man a brand new car. They didn't have the money for it, just like they couldn't give out vacations. They didn't have hundreds of thousands of dollars or scholarships, home renovations, or record deals to hand out. They gave this man only two serviceable tires so he could continue to put food on his table, and it meant the world to him. But at the end of the day, all these sensationalist, feel-good moments, what we would call viral moments, were just a garnish. What the show was always about, and what Souza always wanted it to be about, was crime. The meat and potatoes of the show was still crime, and when Souza switched up the format of Canal Livre, he leaned into that element hard. The biggest immediate change was his shift in attitude and persona. He got verbally tougher in his language and tone. He also decided to make himself the center of attention, more than the crimes he was reporting on. Souza himself would now be the main draw, as he editorialized and talked directly to the cameras in his studio. He railed against the rampant crime in the state. At points, there were fire and brimstone sermons that felt reminiscent of an impassioned pastor. The show punctuated all of this with must-see footage. Canal Livre would show the faces of the neighborhood criminals as they were being arrested. Reporters would confront drug dealers and ask them why they did what they did. Souza himself would interview killers who were just arrested or convicted. During one show, Souza invited a murderer and the victim's mother to the show, then introduced them on live TV. When the audience realized what was happening, they surrounded the murderer to keep him from fleeing. All of this was tame in comparison to action footage Souza started getting out in the field, either personally or from his reporters. He exposed the criminal underbelly of Manaus through his first-hand account investigations. Souza's goal was to get the most unsanitized footage he could find. Year by year, the show became increasingly raw, emotional, harrowing, and graphic. Netflix's docuseries Killer Ratings about Canal Livre's rise and fall showed some of this footage. In one segment, a reporter is surrounded by a crowd in the middle of the street as he looks at the camera and describes what's happening. Quote, "The crime took place around 3 p.m. The police are investigating, but they don't really know what happened." Then the camera pans to a car door. There are 5 bullet holes in the driver's side window. The reporter is literally opening it up as the camera rolls. There's no police tape or even police presence preventing him from doing this. He reveals a man slumped dead in the driver's seat, shattered glass all over him, multiple bullets in his body, and one in the head. The reporter is practically touching him as he gives the audience a first-hand POV to the immediate aftermath of a brutal execution. Another clip shows cops wearing protective bulletproof vests with automatic rifles moving quickly through an alleyway at night. Souza and his cameraman are trying to keep up when multiple gunshots ring out. It's a literal shootout, but Souza and his brave cameraman don't run away. They keep going towards the gunshots, running alongside the police. One more example shows a reporter in the jungle just outside the city. He has his shirt over his nose. Quote, "It smells like barbecue," he says as he treads through the terrain. "Yes, my friend, it's here. Look, here's the body." The reporter moves out of the way so the cameraman can zoom in on the charred, blackened remains of a man. The corpse is still smoking. He says, quote, "The body hasn't been identified yet." It's easy to see why all of this was incredibly shocking footage, especially if 30 seconds ago you were watching a puppet make fun of a guy selling food to the audience and some girl is dancing up on stage, and then it hard cuts to a burnt corpse. This kind of content didn't merely raise the ratings for Canal Livre, they skyrocketed. When the show first started, Souza was driving his own car to crime scenes with one cameraman. As his ratings grew, so did his team in both the studio and in the field. He had a roving crew who were ready at a moment's notice to hustle to any crime scene at any part of the city and surrounding region, no matter what time of day or how dangerous. At its height, a Manaus resident could look out the window at lunchtime and see nearly every TV tuned to local channel 13. One resident even said it felt like there was an echo around the city when the show was on because he could hear every TV airing it. This kind of popularity was what Souza needed to avenge his brother Ulysses. For more than a decade, Souza's plan to disinfect the streets of Manaus with sunlight was working. Violent criminals became scared of a TV host. They would literally run away when they saw Wallace Souza pull up, and gangs would disperse if he was heard driving around the corner. He was a beacon of morality in a decaying city. There was no resource to collect media analytics in Manaus like Nielsen ratings or ComScore, but judging by word of mouth and overall buzz, it was obvious that Canal Livre was the most popular show in the region by a landslide, and Souza was perhaps the most famous figure in the large state of Amazonas. A better way to judge the show's success was to judge its host. Wallace Souza was called a hero. Others labeled him as a savior, a defender of the people. Due to his success, Souza went into politics just a few years after the first episode aired in 1996. He was elected a state deputy in 1998, which is like a state-level representative or assembly person in the United States. Apparently, having an extremely popular reality show has always been a predecessor of politics. Souza now had real political influence in addition to his media power, although one could argue the Venn diagram on those two things overlaps a lot. I would also argue at this point there's a third Venn diagram, or a third circle in the Venn diagram that has, something to do with like children or like being a predator or whatever. That one probably overlaps too, I think. This video isn't about that, I'm sorry. Souza would maintain a foothold in both worlds for the remainder of his life, and he would use one to prop up the other. His political authority and credibility gave him access and sway with local law enforcement, and now every one of his viewers became part of his voting bloc, which was massive to say the least. Most people didn't seem to care about Souza's potential conflicts of interest. He was doing the city a service in a way that nobody else had the capability to, so it made sense on many levels. Or it seemed that way on the surface, at least. It's hard to find any real strong evidence or reliable metric that shows the correlation between Souza's crusade and a reduction in crime in Manaus. This is mostly because many metrics involving crime weren't really taken at the time. However, the city's homicide rate did drop during Souza's run of the show. In 1998, the rate was at its peak at 40 murders per 100,000 people. Coincidentally or not, this was the same year Souza switched his format. Year by year, his ratings rose while the murder rate dropped to 35 in 1999, then to 33 in 2000, then hit its floor in 2001, dipping as low as 25 murders per 100,000 people. In other words, nearly in half. But again, all of these metrics should be taken with a grain of salt. A ton of crime and murders just weren't reported, and there could have been a ton of other factors at play that would make the murder rate go down. But at the very least, Manaus residents felt like their streets were safer because of Souza, and Souza kept spoon-feeding them the feeling of security by what he was showing on TV. It's like that common phrase, perception is reality. Because Souza was validating it on TV, justice was being served. But there was a fair share of concerns starting to mount. Souza had gained a lot of wealth and power in becoming an iconic TV sensation. Power and wealth, if you've spent any time at all watching my channel or, going outside, has a pretty consistent track record of corrupting even the purest of hearts and minds. It can make someone lose the plot. In Souza's case, from initially wanting to avenge his brother to more selfish pursuits. While exposing crime made up the core of his programming, reducing crime was actually not in Souza's best interest anymore. The crime is what the people tuned in to see, so if anything, he needed crime to still exist. I mean, it's what the audience craved. Humans are weird. We're strangely attracted to horrors such as crime and death. Some of us want to watch it be cleaned up, but most of us can't turn away because of the sheer morbidity. At the end of the day, crime is what kept Souza the most powerful man in the large state of Amazonas. But eventually, things began to shift. Some of the more skeptical residents started asking questions about his tactics as well as his conflicts of interest, especially after his popular and buzzy, much talked about clip showing the anonymous charred body. In this instance, the reporter told the audience that the victim was male, that there were no bullet wounds on the body, and that he had been burned using gasoline. Skeptics found it a little suspicious because that's very specific information for a reporter who supposedly just rushed to the crime to already know, especially if the reporter is supposedly seeing this for the first time as we are. This instance also brought to the forefront the fact that Souza's crew always seemed to be the first journalist on the scene. In many cases, Canal Livre would beat the authorities to the crime scene and broadcast information that had not yet been validated. You may be familiar with a movie called Nightcrawler, where Jake Gyllenhaal portrays a creepy crime scene stringer. A stringer is a freelance news videographer who races to a crime scene or fire or crash to film the graphic aftermath so that they can sell the footage to a news station. Stringers try to be at the scene before authorities can block it off so they can get the most raw and graphic and, most importantly, exclusive footage. The closer and more graphic and more exclusive the footage, the more the station would shell out for it. Because, as another stringer in the movie says, quote, "If it bleeds, it leads." A lot of people find this to be an ethically questionable job. Duh, like paparazzi but for dead people. This is how some viewers started to view Canal Livre. But again, most people turn the other cheek because ultimately, Souza was more often than not exposing the criminals. And theoretically, Canal Livre was obtaining their footage in a legal manner by listening to police scanners to find out where to go and try to beat the authorities there. In addition to the scanners, as Canal Livre got more popular, citizens would actually call the producers of the show to report crimes rather than calling 911. Or, whatever Brazil's equivalent of 911 is. They were calling Souza instead of the police. Thanks to this, Souza had visible proof he was doing something about crime in the city. The same couldn't be said about the Manaus police force, who historically had a reputation of internal corruption. Eventually, residents trusted Canal Livre more than the police, so the producer set up a 24/7 hotline for crime tips. But not everything was completely above board. There was also a gray area on how Souza was getting his morbid and voyeuristic footage. There were rumors that Canal Livre was getting inside information from the police. Souza still had friends on the force from his days as an officer. Now that he was a state official with credibility and power, some cops wanted to curry favor with him. They started tipping off Souza before any information crossed a scanner so he could be the first one on the scene. Sometimes they would even wait for him to get there before beginning the investigation. Not to be reductive, but it's kind of like Gotham City or Commissioner Gordon's relationship with Batman. Souza and the police were working hand in hand to fight crime, maybe skirting a few rules here and there. I mean, after all, if the ends justify the means, then it's worth it to get this guy on scene sooner, especially if he can do more than the police can in some instances. The only thing missing was a giant spotlight, but it was okay because, in general, everything was working according to the best interest of the city, and everyone was happy. For the most part. That's because one day, everything changed in an instant. Crime scene that Souza did not get to first flipped the entire narrative. In October of 2008, a man called in a tip. He said he knew the whereabouts of a known and wanted drug dealer. Unfortunately for Souza, this tip was called in to the Manaus Police Department rather than his show. The tip led to the police raiding the home of a man named Moacir Jorge de Costa, or as he was known on the streets, Moi. In addition to being a drug dealer, Moi was also known to be an enforcer, otherwise known as a hitman. At first, Moi didn't think he was actually going to jail. He thought that the man who ordered his hits would again find a way to keep him out of real trouble. And it wasn't a bad assumption. At the time of the raid, Moi had already been charged with 9 homicides, and he still wasn't in jail. Clearly, whoever hired him to carry out these hits was very powerful and well connected. This time was different though. Moi was arrested, and nobody was coming to save him. When he realized this, he did what rats do. He ratted. He told the police he'd give up the name of his boss in exchange for some sort of lenience. He wanted to talk to someone who could help negotiate a deal. Several of the investigators in the room, they probably thought the best person to call was Souza. I mean, after all, he'd done this before. But instead of calling Wallace Souza to negotiate, Moi identified Souza as the person who had ordered all of his hits. That is right, I'm not kidding. According to this hitman, he had been Souza's personal hitman for a long time. A statement from Manaus Police Detective Divinilson Cavalcante read in part, quote, "A meeting took place at the home of a criminal boss who told them to go out into the city of Manaus and commit crimes, robberies, homicides." The detective was paraphrasing Moi's testimony, but the insinuation was that Wallace Souza was the criminal boss he spoke about. This was an absolutely bombshell of a confession. Cavalcante said, quote, "When I read Moi's statement, at first it seemed like fantasy. Everything he said was unbelievable." Maybe it really was unbelievable at first. After all, how could anyone trust the word of a known lifelong criminal whose back was against the wall, especially when he was implicating the savior of Manaus? Despite Moi's long, violent rap sheet and the questionable position he was in, the police didn't take this allegation lightly. There were quite a few Souza skeptics on the police force too, some who didn't necessarily like what Souza was doing or how he was doing it. So, after Moi's statement, the Manaus Police Department felt the need to find the truth, to corroborate Moi's story. They arrested 15 more drug dealers and/or gang members who were alleged to have a relationship with Souza. Souza denied all of this adamantly, of course. He said someone was trying to frame him. It was only natural that people would come after him and try to bring him down because of what he was doing. And if that sounds familiar, it's basically the same defense he had given right before his dishonorable exit from the police department decades earlier. So either he was framed twice, or maybe not at all. On top of this, Souza specifically denied any kind of relationship with Moi whatsoever. Quote from Souza, "They wanted to find a way to destroy me. They unfortunately arrested a naive, unsuspecting guy and offered him a deal, including a plea bargain. Moi claims that I killed people and trafficked drugs, but where are the charges? Where's the concrete evidence?" Well, there was some. An unknown source, for example, had a photo of Souza and Moi hanging out at a pool together. While it didn't prove that he had been involved in any crime, this proved that his initial denial was patently false. Souza pivoted from his initial statement that he had no idea who Moi was, now saying that while he did know the man in the photo, he thought his name was Jorge, not Moi, and that the reason they had been seen together was because Moi was his son Raphael's jiu-jitsu trainer, and that Raphael had invited Moi over for a barbecue. At the time the photo was taken, Souza said that the two men were just hanging out as acquaintances. And he was just coincidentally talking to a mob hitman who claimed that he was the mob boss, a super rich and well-connected guy. And that he was just, by coincidence, as the crime show guy, talking to a dude who turned out to be a huge hitman in the city, who was coincidentally his son's jiu-jitsu instructor. In terms of pretty obvious pivots to avoid accusations, "He's my son's jiu-jitsu trainer" is pretty high up on the best of list, along with Bill Clinton's "I never inhaled" and Lance Armstrong's "Fine, sure, okay, you got me. I was doping, but everybody was doing it." Unfortunately for Wallace Souza, none of these examples had great endings, including his own. And as was true with all of them, the lie was just the beginning. The Manaus police created a task force to investigate. It was led by the Secretary of Intelligence and made up of civil police and the prosecutor's office. The public perception, which had been so important in Wallace Souza's crusade and journey to the top, had officially shifted. Hypothetically, if what Moi said was true, it would give a much more sinister context to all the crimes broadcasted on Canal Livre. And while no one expected Souza to have been responsible for every single crime he showcased or talked about, it definitely raised some serious doubt about the overall integrity of the show. I mean, duh. The guy covers criminals for a living, and now he is potentially, allegedly, a massive criminal responsible for 9 murders, at least. At the very least, these revelations would explain how Souza had so bravely run into drug dens and dark alleys during shootouts. He was never in serious peril. It also helped explain how Souza and his Canal Livre team were so quick to arrive on so many crime scenes, because he was personally tapped into the city's seedy underbelly. It would also explain why Souza heroically sacrificed himself and got into a pickup truck with a gun-wielding kidnapper. It's easy to be a hero when you know the outcome. Also, at the time, there was a lot of rumors surrounding Raphael's alleged involvement in the crimes that Canal Livre showcased. Again, Raphael being Souza's son. The Netflix docuseries alleged Raphael playing a large role in the murder of the charred man. According to the documentary, he helped kidnap the victim during a drug deal on a boat. Then he drove the unconscious man out in the jungle, doused him in gasoline, and set him on fire. I wouldn't call that a large role in the murder. I would just call that the murder. Like, can you have any other role in a murder besides killing the person? If someone else drove the boat, then maybe that's a large role, but I think that's just alleging that he killed him. But all of this was still speculation. It was Moi's word against Souza's. And Moi was as unreliable of a witness as they come. Perhaps he was scared of what would happen to him if he went to jail, but Moi changed his tune, and then changed it again, and then again. His allegiances were constantly shifting back and forth. He ratted Souza out, then denied knowing him. Even with the photo evidence, he said he never hung out with Souza, just his son Raphael. He stated, quote, "I was never in the pool with the representative." Which, I mean, maybe is technically true, because in the photo, Souza's in the pool and Moi's just kind of sitting on the ledge of the pool, but that is both of you in the photograph, and your feet are in. That counts. Things got really complicated when Moi's wife reached out to the Human Rights Committee and told them that Moi, quote, was beaten by the government and that he suffered psychological pressure. They interrogated him in the middle of the night. He signed papers without knowing what they are. Essentially, she was saying Moi's confession and allegations against Souza were coerced. She named Tomás Vasconcelos, the Secretary of Intelligence, as the man who was physically torturing Moi. And Moi rolled with it. Quote, "What they've done to me, you wouldn't have even done to a dog. I had to defecate on a piece of newspaper like an animal. They didn't hit me, but they put 5 plastic bags over my head. They told me that if I said anything, they would say I'd try to escape and shoot me." If this were true, then it begs the question, why would the authorities want to bring down Wallace Souza, the man supposedly cleaning up the city and making their job easier? Or, more specifically, who would want to? The theory was that Souza knew that Ariel Pinheiro, the mayor of a wealthy oil city called Quarry, was running a pedophilia network. According to this theory, the mayor wanted Souza off his back before he was exposed. So he framed Souza using Vasconcelos and Moi. If the Secretary of Intelligence was actually coercing allegations against a TV host, the scenario could play perfectly in Souza's defense. Well, the theory turned out to be half true, and eventually Pinheiro served more than a decade in prison for crimes against children. But the Human Rights Committee concluded that Moi's torture story was not true. The task force did, however, get a hold of Moi's cell phone records, where they found at least 20 calls to Souza and other known members of his inner circle. And as you can imagine, and as the courts determined, these calls probably didn't have to do with his son's jiu-jitsu class. This was damning evidence, and nothing seemed hypothetical anymore. The story had gone from Souza didn't know who this guy was, to prior to all of this, they were well connected and had multiple calls between himself and his inner members. The reality of Souza's show was that out of the hundreds and hundreds of criminals Canal Livre outed on TV, it was the host who was the most violent criminal of all. In Brazil, politicians have something called parliamentary immunity. This meant that Souza was granted full immunity from civil and criminal prosecution. This is an absolutely insane precedent. Think about that. If you're a politician, you are granted immunity from civil and criminal cases. That seems like an absolutely horrible idea. Advocates of this ethically and morally questionable law say that it's necessary for a democratic institution, which is an even more insane response. They're like, well, if we ever charged any of our politicians for things like murder or theft, then we wouldn't have a government, would we? And I'm over here like, what? You know, I talk big game for the guy who lives in a country who had many of its major leaders, taking little island trips every now and then. So I guess they're at least honest about it. Their argument is you don't want politicians using the law to try and defeat their political opponents, because imagine the mess that would cause. Either way, Souza couldn't be served a search warrant or any kind of warrant. But his son Raphael lived with him, and Raphael wasn't a government official. With that loophole, the task force served Souza's son. And in April of 2009, about half a year after Moa's arrest, the police swooped in and raided the Souza home as Wallace Souza watched, unable to do anything about it. Through this arrest, the authorities found even more evidence. A lot of cash, illegal ammunition, a list of weapons and spent bullets, not the casings, the actual bullet projectiles. A ballistic comparison showed that these were the same type of rounds used in at least one murder victim tied to Wallace Souza. They also found a list of drug dealers that had been killed. Keeping lists with names of people that are now dead is never a good idea. This prompted the task force to carry out another series of arrests. At least 8 more people tied to Souza were brought in, and many of them were in possession of guns that matched the same caliber of bullets that killed the victims from that drug dealer list. Which on its own is just circumstantial evidence, but with all of the other stuff happening, you can imagine. People started to believe that Wallace Souza was actually the boss of a drug trafficking gang, and the criminals he was going after on his show were members of rival factions, which is crazy, but given the evidence, definitely not out of the question. The police arrested Raphael, but still could not arrest his dad. Wallace Souza defended his son throughout the entire investigation, even with all the evidence. Souza's attorney said that Wallace had no idea his son had been doing all of this. Basically, despite sniffing out crime anywhere in the entire city, he couldn't do it under his own roof. Some people bought that idea that it was his son doing all of this, but most did not. Some of the other personalities on the show came under fire too, with some believing that, if the allegations were true, it would have been hard to believe that the rest of the team had been unaware of Souza's connection. Vanessa Lima was one of the other members of Souza's team who was called out. She wasn't the star, but she was definitely a recognizable face. If someone knew who Wallace Souza was, they knew who Vanessa Lima was. Police issued a warrant for her arrest, and she turned herself in. According to her interview on Killer Ratings, the police interrogated her with guns pointed at her. She said they ordered her to make a statement condemning and admitting the truth about Souza. The police denied this, which created another he said, she said situation. Ultimately, Lima never made a statement against Souza, but she did have this to say about the task force. Quote, "There are 2 sides. There's the side of truth and the side of the task force." The investigation also called in reporter Giselle Vaz. According to Vaz, the investigation gave her 2 options. Quote, "Either you tell us everything you know, or you could be arrested. Like everything in this complicated case, these simple options were not black and white." She responded by adding the consequences of her decision. Quote, "You are giving me 2 options. I don't talk and go to jail, ruining my name, or I talk and I will be killed." She added that she has 2 kids who would be affected by this. Eventually, Vaz did talk. She gave hours of testimony where she said she noticed that this man Moa was doing a little more than dipping his feet in Souza's pool. In fact, Moa dove head into Souza's world. He would accompany Souza as a security guard when Souza went to crime scenes, and he likely did a little more than just provide protection. Quote, "I started to notice that something was wrong. They would arrive at someone's house without a warrant and simply force their way in." She also said that if anyone was being framed, it was Souza framing innocent people. If Souza or his team didn't find any criminal activity, Moa or someone else would plan it, or, quote, "bring it from the car," as she put it. "I saw fake drug trafficking setups many times. I saw many innocent people go to jail. Representative Wallace was responsible. He was the boss. And if anyone was coercing false allegations, it was Souza doing the coercing. Quote, "There was a place in Manaus where they took these people. The police would take them there. They had a technique called the bag." Leaning a bit away from the Dark Knight and more into the Punisher territory. If the Punisher didn't really pick his targets. The task force now needed to find a way around the parliamentary immunity to hold Representative Wallace accountable. This was complicated. They had to prove that Souza engaged in a, quote, "breach of parliamentary decorum." If they could do that, they could get Souza booted from his state office, which would leave him vulnerable to be arrested as a common citizen. Souza is on the record as saying, quote, "They want me impeached so they can arrest me and destroy me. That is their goal." And that's exactly what they did. They destroyed him in the form of a 500-page dossier, which was presented to the state assembly. The investigation and prosecutors also leaked information about the case to the press, which prompted the public to put enough pressure on the assembly to go through with the impeachment. First, of course, the assembly needed to conduct their own investigation with an ethics committee. This committee needed a statement from Souza. They would eventually get their statement, but after years in TV and politics, Souza knew the importance of public opinion. He needed his millions of viewers back on his side. In early 2009, Souza was diagnosed with a dilated spleen and blocked heart vein. He was in and out of the hospital, and he used that to his advantage in the craziest way. The committee had offered to come to Souza in the hospital to collect his statement in private, which seems like the practical thing to do, but that's not what happened. Instead, Souza had himself taken down to Parliament in an ambulance, where he entered the building on a stretcher with hundreds of people watching and dozens of cameras rolling. He declared his innocence with a doctor by his side. Souza knew exactly what this would look like. He didn't want Parliament to do the kind thing and come to him for his statement. He wanted it to appear that he was being forced, a sickly man, to get in a gurney and then placed in an ambulance to go testify his own innocence. By now, it wasn't just the Amazonas state watching Souza. It wasn't even just all of Brazil. Souza wanted compelling, must-watch TV, and he got it. The whole world was watching him. Speaking to the assembly and the world from a stretcher hooked up to oxygen, Souza maintained that the whole thing was a political ploy. He was being framed by his opponents. But in the middle of this statement, a doctor came in to interrupt, announcing that it would be cut short due to his worsening condition. It appeared to be more showmanship from Brazil's greatest showman. Later, in an interview, Wallace's son, Rafael, would insist that his father really had health issues. Quote, "Nothing was staged. He suffered greatly. But if he was suffering, that was a convenient time to do so." In October of 2009, a year after Moa's bombshell confession, the assembly convened for an impeachment vote. Souza, being Souza, demanded that he gave a final plea of innocence before the vote was conducted. He didn't have a stretcher or doctor this time, but he was wearing a white suit to symbolize peace, and then he read passages from the Bible. But none of that worked. It only took 13 yes votes to get him impeached, and the vote was 16 yeses and 4 noes, while 3 members abstained. So the police went at him as soon as they could. They drove to Souza's house with a warrant for his arrest, but he wasn't there. He was hiding at a friend's house while the police patrolled the airports and closed the borders around Manaus. And after a 4-day manhunt, Souza turned himself in. He said he didn't want to give himself up because he thought they would throw him in jail with the regular inmates. According to his attorney, quote, "where he would certainly face many criminals whom he denounced on his TV show." Souza was now the one scared of the criminals. He won this small battle. The jail gave him his own cell, separate from the criminals he put in prison, and presumably also some of the innocents. Ultimately, however, that wouldn't matter very much. He had been diagnosed with Budd-Chiari syndrome, a rare condition where blood flow from the liver becomes blocked, and Souza was dying. While his body was deteriorating, Souza was charged with several counts of homicide, but that number was nowhere close to the number of deaths many people believed he was responsible for. Wallace Souza was never convicted. He died on July 27, 2010, at the age of 51, before a jury could render a verdict. The trial didn't continue, and Canal Livre died alongside him. Nobody assumed the role of host. At the very least, the city of Manaus now felt safer, whether because his show really had impacted crime or because he was no longer there to add to it. Ma was never convicted of homicide either, but ended up serving 5 years in prison for drug trafficking. And Rafael Souza, Souza's son, was convicted of murder and sentenced to 9 years, which that may sound light, but is kind of par for the course in Brazil. Most upsettingly of all, however, was the realization for many that reality TV might not actually be real. Maybe not the best time joked, but hey, we're just going to roll through it. Even though he was never convicted, there weren't really any questions about whether or not Wallace Souza committed crimes. Everyone just assumes he did, but his death did leave other questions. After Souza's downfall, organized crime appeared to spike. It could be that Wallace Souza left a power vacuum, the kind of chaotic situation that happens when authority suddenly disappears, and power-seeking forces compete to fill the void by whatever means necessary. Same kind of thing that happens when dictators get assassinated and tech CEOs get forced out of their own company. Or maybe Souza really was keeping a lid on the crime in Manaus by committing crimes himself. Most of the people he was presumed to take out or put away were criminals in some sort of fashion, small or large. Of course, this would mean he really was the boss of a gang or cartel to know these things, but either way, something he was doing was working. Maybe none of that matters. In the beginning, Wallace Souza set out to avenge his brother by waging a war on crime and cleaning up the city. He was the Batman of the Amazon. Or was he? As I mentioned in the video's intro, really more of a two-face. A public presence that stood for justice on one side while being every bit the evil he said he wanted to end. Depending on who you ask, the man was certainly a vigilante or a villain. I said earlier in this video that it's hard for me to not find him cool, and that was kind of a minimizing way to put it. But what I mean by that is he was a person, by all accounts, who was horribly affected by the drug problem in his country. He watched his brother die, and he watched the city around him suffer from the crime that the drugs brought. So he becomes an officer, and assuming the conspiracy is true, gets kicked out from that. And then he starts a TV show that makes criminals become afraid of the light. And if his story ended there, I think we could undoubtedly say he's a hero, but obviously the biggest bump in the road is the killing. In my opinion, what I think might have happened is Souza, who was kicked out of what he believed to be a corrupt police force, again, assuming the initial conspiracy against him was true. He saw the police weren't getting anything done, and he saw there was only so much that could be done on television. So perhaps he decided if you're going to clean up the dirt, you've got to get your hands dirty. So he began working with a mob hitman to take out criminals as they appear, using his money to perform the only justice that maybe he thought would stick around. But that is looking at all of the details of this case in the most favorable light. And if it ended there, even then, I think it would be palpable to most. Guy's family died from drug violence. These drug dealers are killing people every day. Someone's got to take him out. But even though these victims were, in the area of drug problems and criminal rings, because they were murdered and charges never brought against them, we don't know that. If Souza was just operating like Dexter and exclusively killing other killers in the city, maybe it would be more justified. But when he becomes judge and jury along with executioner, it's way more murky, especially considering he's using a known gang hitman to get these things done. And together that connection, he probably had to rub a lot of shoulders and perform a lot of favors with people in the space. So yes, I do sympathize with the guy taking extreme measures to try to, as he sees it, keep people safe, but at what point does he become the thing that he's trying to destroy? Because now he's just a politician with a lot of money and a hitman getting rid of people that he doesn't like. Were they criminals who deserve to be stopped? Maybe. Thanks to him, we'll never know. And of course, perhaps the most glaring testimony against him is his own behavior regarding these crimes. Because it's one thing if you use your money to clean up the streets. It's another if you use your money to clean up the streets and then make a ton of money promoting it on your TV show. Obviously, everything he does has to be called into question. If some of these killings were ones orchestrated by him that he then gets to first and blows up on his TV show. Even if it started as some form of frontier justice, it devolved into another profit scheme. There might have been good intentions at the base of it, but by the end, they were too blurred to matter. As the title of the Netflix documentary implies, at some point you're just killing for ratings. I also think he's an interesting case study because of the format of the show itself. Like in the late 90s, mixing true crime with sensationalism was unheard of, at least outside of, newspaper headlines. There weren't people combining comedy and showgirls and all of these visually appealing details in order to sell a murder case. But now, with the internet, that's just another Tuesday. Most of us pair the words true crime and sensationalist in our minds like peanut butter and jelly. And on the surface, ignoring all of the stuff that he was found out for near the end of his career, it seems again like an altruistic mission. He wants to get these faces out there. He wants these cases to be known and not forgotten. So just do something on the show to get attention, because attention results in arrest and a safer city. Again, if it wasn't for what came later, I think that could be justified. If people need to know about these things, then whatever gets them through the door. But as it turned out to be true for him and several other sensationalist true crime-esque things online, it's just about the view. There's not some greater purpose or objective at the base of this whole thing. It's money and attention. So what I mean by it's hard to not find him cool is because I want the idea of talk show host realizing the system can't get things done, so he uses his resource to get something done. Even if it's by means as grisly as murder, I want to believe he is doing that to stop murders happening to innocent people. But I can't, because that's not what the evidence shows. We don't know if these guys that he killed were even killers. We don't know if there was a significant change when his show came out. Maybe it was all coincidental. We know after he left, the crime struck back up. Maybe that's because the TV show's over, or maybe it's because he was so connected to the mob that he created a vacuum and a vie for power. And ultimately, the one thing we know that he did do was profit off of these killings. And at that point, he's just a serial killer who's also finding a way to make money off of it. It's a fascinating case, and one that I think there's a lot of complexity to, and one that deserves to be remembered. And hopefully if you stuck around this long, you do as well. And I appreciate it and just want to say thank you for watching. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Was he a misunderstood hero? Was he a monster in sheepskin? It's certainly one of the most unique criminal cases that I've ever come across, so of course I had to talk about it. Anyway, not to counter all the stuff I said a moment ago about sensationalism and true crime, which I'm not saying I'm totally immune from criticism of. I try to be, but I'm also a YouTuber, so I'm sure I'm not perfect. Not to diminish all of that, I hope you all enjoyed the video, or at least found the topic interesting or educational. More content in similar veins coming soon, so stay tuned to the channel if you're interested. We upload here Mondays at noon, and then like bi-weekly over on Wendiglitch, and then a couple times a month over on Wendigoon. Everyone who made this video possible will be credited in the description, so be sure to show them some love. And all in all, I believe that should do it for now, but before I go, we just want to say thank you for watching. We hope that you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye! You know, since I brought up Batman, I feel like if Batman was real, also it's not lost on me that his son was named Raphael and did jujitsu. Every time I said his name after that, I was imagining a giant turtle with the side blades just standing in his house. And like when I talked about the police coming to arrest him, I imagined they needed 2 pairs of handcuffs because he had 4 arms. Wait, did the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles didn't have 4 arms? Where did I get that from? Wait, hold on. Oh, Shredder had 4 arms in the cartoon. That's where I got it from. Well, that's something completely different. Okay, whatever. You get what I mean.